Good morning, everybody, from New York, where the thunderstorm has just passed. Unfortunately, the clouds have not passed over the world. The thunderstorms are still raging all over, and there seem to be new ones popping up every day. So when we heard that Abiodun Williams was publishing his book on global leadership and Kofi Annan, it seemed a very opportune time to look, because the United Nations is involved, perhaps too tangentially, in issue after issue after issue. And we really need to look at what does leadership entail. And I have to say, and I'm not expecting Abby, he might want to get another job in the UN, needs to join in, but there's a lot of people who think the current Secretary General is not up to the mark, and they make odious comparisons with Kofi Annan and indeed with Ban Ki-moon in terms of principle and activity. And there are subtle differences, because there's been many a volume, of which Abby's is just the latest, on the role of the Secretary General, who is a peculiar mixture. Secular Pope is described as often. And he's a bit like the real Pope, because Stalin said about the Pope during the Second World War, how many divisions does he have? And Butcher-Scarley quite explicitly said, I have no police force, I have no missions, I have no government, so I can only do what the nation states want me to, which is the dilemma of all Secretaries General, especially since his job is mostly to try and hold the same nation states in check. So, Abby, what impelled you to write the book, apart from the happy coincidence that you were working in the Secretary General's office during the relevant period?
Well, Ian, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I think the main reason I wanted to write the book was I thought that Kofi Annan was such an extraordinary Secretary General, and that there were lessons to be learned from the way he led the United Nations at a very turbulent time in the history of the UN. He was also, of course, the first Secretary General from Sub-Saharan Africa, the first Black African Secretary General, and also the first and so far the only Secretary General who rose to that position through the ranks of the UN system. So he broke the mold, and he had really an extraordinary knowledge about the UN, the workings of the organization. And I also thought it would be important to look at his leadership of the organization, the personal qualities, which had an impact in terms of how he led the UN, to look at the issues that he raised at a very difficult time, and that his experience and his leadership of the UN over a decade would have some lessons for the present moment.
Well, certainly, who was it? I think it was Winston Churchill said about his British rival who beat him, that he was a modest man, and indeed he had much to be modest about. And Kofi Annan was indeed modest, but he didn't have that much to be modest about. He was extremely quiet, and he did a lot without swinging from the rafters and grandstanding. But he did quietly make sure he was quite confident that he could stand on the world stage. And like you, I knew him during this period, and especially in connection with the responsibility to protect and the possibilities of intervention, which is very relevant at the moment with Gaza and the Congo, come to think of it, and God, everywhere across the world. Myanmar, do countries stand by and watch governments murder their own people, or even murder others' people, without intervening, because state sovereignty is more sacred? And of course, Kofi had come in at a particularly bad period, because most of the world was united in horror at the American and British attempts to rewrite sovereignty to mean everybody's sovereign except when we want them not to be. And it was that particular exception that he had to wrestle and get support for this concept from people. But his reports were, I think it was just before you came, was it, or at the same time, that his reports on Rwanda and Bosnia and Srebrenica were especially relevant because they're both live issues at the moment. In Rwanda, we have Paul Kagame, who many people in the world have decided, a bit like a Holocaust survivor, cannot be touched or criticized in any way, no matter what he or his secret agents do. And then we have Bosnia, where the Prime Minister of Serbia is in effect saying, hey, why do you keep mentioning this massacre business at Srebrenica? Yes, maybe we did it, but you shouldn't. It's rude to mention it. I think that's the gist of what he's saying. And this sort of spurious sovereignty and independence is very galling. I mean, the bodies at Srebrenica, the horror of when it happened, and the admitted complicity by Kofi of the UN were one of the things that impelled him. You know, Kofi was actually in charge of peacekeeping when these disasters happened, and he admitted that in his reports, which made the reports even bolder. They weren't laundered completely. So, what do you think his biggest achievement was, and what did he do that couldn't be done now?
I think, well, you're absolutely right. The responsibility to protect was a response to the failure of the international community to respond to the genocide and the mass atrocities in Rwanda, in former Yugoslavia, including at Srebrenica in the 1990s. And as you say, that the failure of the international community to respond to those disasters had a tremendous impact on Kofi Annan. And he took from those experiences, when he became Secretary General, the desire and the motivation to do something about the failure of the international community to respond. It also is a reflection of his leadership, because all good leaders make mistakes. And Kofi learned from those mistakes. He acknowledged those mistakes in making sure that you had very hard-hitting reports on Rwanda and Srebrenica, which he made public. And he resolved to do something about those mistakes. And the responsibility to protect, which is now the organizing principle of the international community's effort to prevent and respond to mass atrocities, is a reflection of the Annan Doctrine. And the Annan Doctrine is that state sovereignty should not be an excuse and a shield for countries to carry out mass atrocities. In fact, Kofi Annan's understanding, he had an understanding of sovereignty, two sovereignties, a sovereignty for states and the sovereignty of peoples. And for Kofi Annan, the state exists to serve human beings and its citizens, not the other way around. And so he pushed very much to have, of course, the Canadian government sponsored the International Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention, which came up with the idea of the responsibility to protect in 2001. And then Kofi pushed in the last wave of his reforms in 2005 to get the 2005 World Summit, where all the member states of the United Nations unanimously accepted their responsibility to protect civilians from the four atrocity crimes: genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And this meant a great deal to him. In fact, when he left office, he referred to the responsibility to protect as his most precious achievement.
And indeed it was. I was heavily involved in reporting on the Balkans at the time, and it was a big step forward, it seemed. Although it's a step in principle, but we haven't seen too much of it in practice lately. Although he did implement it in East Timor around about that time, or he managed to get it implemented. But I mean, the Canadians are a case in point here, because that report you're talking about was very detailed. They went all over the world. I'm trying to remember the name of the foreign minister, because he's just put a suggestion up for Gaza now. But it was very clear. It had a lot of small print about the dangers of intervention. Because round about then, of course, Tony Blair was using this as an excuse to, we don't like Saddam Hussein, therefore we will invoke humanitarian intervention to go get rid of him. Or, the same for anybody else in the world. So it's, on the one hand, he was trying to sick everybody onto these cases, and on the other hand, Kofi was trying to restrain them, which is why, of course, they came after him with the Oil for Food program, which probably everybody's forgotten about now. I've discovered when I've been speaking to students in groups that nobody remembers the Oil for Food so-called scandal, which was at the time considered to be the biggest financial scandal in human history, according to William Safire and the neoconservatives in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. But it was quite clear for those of us there that it was a piece of neoconservative vindictiveness trying to stick the knife into Kofi.
Yeah, I think the process leading up to the adoption of the responsibility to protect in 2005 gives us a real good example about the way that Kofi Annan led the United Nations, because he used the bully pulpit after, of course, what had happened in Rwanda and Srebrenica and in the 90s. He used the bully pulpit in a series of very critical and important speeches to raise the issue of what happens when you have mass atrocities occurring and what the international community's responsibility is. So the effective use of the bully pulpit, and it challenged member states that a way had to be found to address this issue. And then that provided an opportunity for the Canadians, a member state, to then take this issue and set up a commission. And the commission then came up with this idea of the responsibility to protect. And then Kofi Annan then ensured that this would be put into the political bloodstream, if you were. So in his last major report, reform report, Enlarge Freedom, he included in that report the recommendation that the member states should accept and adopt the responsibility to protect. So you have him using the bully pulpit, challenging the guardians of sovereignty, asking them to come up with a new norm which would help the United Nations and the international community prevent mass atrocities, getting, of course, then the Canadians taking up the lead of the Secretary General, and then him putting it, as I said, into the political bloodstream, and we having the adoption in 2005. It's a very good example of how a Secretary General, as you were saying at the outset, who does not have any political power in the traditional sense. He has no troops. The Secretary General cannot levy taxes, but a Secretary General has tremendous moral authority. And the moral authority of the position, Kofi Annan was able to use the moral authority of the position and also to use the bully pulpit when necessary. He also had a good sense that you could lead the member states, but you couldn't get too far ahead of them so that you lose them. So that good political sense of challenging them, leading them, but not getting too far ahead of them. And then, of course, recognizing when it is important then for member states to take on certain initiatives.
Yeah, he was always, as you point out in the book several times, he was always very sensitive to how far he could push the envelope out. with the members. He pushed it out as far as he could, but he realized that sometimes it would be counterproductive. Yeah, you know, like telling Madeleine Albright that she was wrong.
Yes, indeed. There's a
Not a
good
clever diplomatic move, as I know, since I fell athwart her several times just for asking the wrong questions.
Yes, he could stake out a moral position, and he chose opportunities to stake out a moral position, but he knew that and he could push the envelope, and he chose opportunities to do that, but he knew that you couldn't get too far ahead of the member states, so much so that you lose them. This was also, of course, you saw it in the case in terms of human rights. He was unlike his predecessors, he was the first Secretary General who really had a keen interest in human rights and was an advocate for human rights, which he saw as he put it, the very heart of the UN's mission. And he saw human rights as intrinsically linked with security and development. In fact, development, security, and human rights for him went together. And so he would challenge member states on human rights questions. He also tried to use the UN parlance, mainstream the human rights into the work of the UN. And one of the, I think, major achievements of Kofi Annan and his major legacy, institutional legacy and human rights, of course, is the Human Rights Council. He saw that its predecessor, the Human Rights Commission, had been discredited, and he wanted to elevate human rights to the level institutionally of security. We have the Security Council, we have the Economic and Social Council, focusing on economic and social issues, but he felt that the institutional structure of the UN was missing. And so that was part of his reason for pushing the Human Rights Council and elevating it institutionally within the UN.
I regret to say that it was a wonderful achievement. However, it would appear to have been dulled completely by the same people who made the Human Rights Council, the previous body, ineffective. That when you have Iran on the body, it's got to be somewhat questionable. And when members are allowed to stymie investigations, because I remember the negotiations, and they were very intricate about balancing people's worries with their aspirations, so that you'd have this balance of basically it was the third world making sure they weren't perpetually in the dock with the US and the Europeans pointing fingers at them, and the legitimate fears of many people that bad actors would be able to take it over and make sure they were never investigated or pilloried in any way. And those bad actors tended to include people from the P5 quite often. So, I mean, and were you privy to any of the discussions with Kofi about this?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, I would say in terms of human rights, his commitment to human rights came from his own personal values and his own beliefs and his convictions. I think his background, his values. He often said that, of course, he studied at Mfanzipim, which is an elite boarding school in Ghana. It was founded by the Methodists in the late 19th century. And he said studying at Mfanzipim and the values of that school had an impact on him. The culture, of course, in terms of Ghana, and the emphasis on the individual and the importance of individual rights, even as you're a member of a community. And then he also said that the situation in South Africa and apartheid in South Africa and had a tremendous impact on him in terms of the importance of human rights. So all of that, I think, had an impact in terms of his attitude and the importance of human rights when he became Secretary General. The negotiations leading up to the Human Rights Council were very difficult. They were very protracted. The initial, of course, suggestions he made about the council, the size of the council, who should be on it, some of that was, of course, was watered down because ultimately the Secretary General proposes, but it is the member states who decide. So compromises were made during the negotiations, but I think an important component of the Human Rights Council was the fact that you had this universal periodic review where all member states get to be reviewed. I think that is and was an important innovation. But ultimately, as you're saying, the test of the council is, of course, how the member states use it and the use that they make of the Human Rights Council.
And of course, it tends to be expedient. I don't think you're going to see His Majesty's government, I've got to catch up with history, welcoming inquiries into the British immigration laws at the moment, for example, even though many other people think that they should be looked at, or indeed the British government's attitude towards arms sales to Israel, which is yet another cogent subject that comes in here. It's because that's one of the key issues. He recognized that South Africa was the defining issue for much of the world, and especially the third world and Africa. But the Holocaust still resonated with the Europeans. And I think a lot of the third world were always a little puzzled that he paid such deference, because he'd gone to a Methodist school, he'd been educated in America, so he knew how much this was a bellwether issue in Western human rights. I must say a castrated bellwether issue at the moment, with events that are going on. What did he do that made the UN feasible? That's the key issue, because one of the complaints at the moment for many people is that very few people will say that malign things about the current Secretary General, but many people think that he's missing in action, that he's missed many opportunities to use any kind of pulpit, whether it's a bully pulpit or otherwise, and that he has stayed silent when he should have used the UN to castigate bad actors. When he was quick on Ukraine, which was surprising, and eventual on Gaza, but there are still many issues around the world that could pay from naming and shaming, is what they used to call it at the UN.
Well, I mean, that's a fascinating question. Kofi Annan made the UN visible in a number of different ways. So, for example, when he took office, he was the architect of the Millennium Development Goals. And those Millennium Development Goals was the very first time that you had the international community coming around a shared set of goals. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals paved the way for the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, which we now have. So that was one way in which he showed the relevance and the importance of the UN. If we go back to the late 1990s when he took office, we had the world community was facing the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which was devastating communities all over the world, especially in Africa. Now, Kofi Annan used the moral authority of his position to emphasize that the discrimination and the stigma which was associated with those who were victims of HIV/AIDS had to stop. And he used his advocacy, which led to the creation of the Global Fund, which has saved millions of lives. He also used his convening power to bring the CEOs of the leading pharmaceutical companies. And his convening of the CEOs, by the way, it was very controversial. You know, there were some in his entourage who felt that the Secretary General should not be sitting down with the bad CEOs of companies, and he should not be engaged in this issue. But he felt that if you were going to deal with this epidemic, you needed the support of the private sector. And those convening meetings which Kofi had with these CEOs of pharmaceutical companies ultimately led to making the industry making antiretroviral drugs available in developing countries at affordable prices. And this again was showing the Secretary General in front of a very important and a very critical issue. I also think if you look in terms of the UN itself, a gaping hole in the UN, of course, was having a structure to deal with peace building, because peacekeeping has been around for decades, for almost for as long as the UN itself. But a number of countries where you had had peacekeeping troops deployed were relapsing into conflict. And so it was clear that the UN needed an institutional mechanism to help countries make the difficult transition from war to peace. So in his last wave of reforms, we had the peace-building architecture of the UN, comprising the Peace-Building Commission, the Peace-Building Support Office, and the Peace-Building Fund, which is helping a number of countries make this transition. So he was not afraid to lead on difficult issues and also to stick out a position which was necessary.
Now, of course, a cynic would say this would be saying things about deck chairs, Titanic, moving them about. Can you elaborate on the concrete successes of the peace building initiative?
Well, I think, for example, the Peace Building Commission, well, first let me say this. Part of the leadership of the Secretary General, of course, is always to try to find a middle ground between what is optimally possible and what the political traffic in New York would bear. So I give an example of the negotiations of the Peace Building Commission. Kofi was convinced that the Peace Building Commission should have a preventive mandate. But this was, of course, the aftermath of the Iraq War. And it was very, very clear that there were many, many countries in the global South who were worried that the Peace Building Commission would become a Trojan horse for intervention, and that if you had a preventive mandate for the Peace Building Commission, this could be exploited by powerful countries to intervene. So he had to make a very difficult choice between letting go of what he felt was the ideal to have a preventive mandate of a Peace Building Commission or not having a Peace Building Commission at all. So he chose and decided that the political traffic would not bear to have a preventive mandate for the Commission. But having the Commission, which has worked with countries like Burundi, for example, and trying to support other countries would be an asset to the organization. So there's always, as I said, trying to negotiate between what is optimally possible and what the political traffic would bear in New York. And that was a good example, I think, of the peace building architecture which was set up. I also, of course, think that part of global leadership, and Kofi demonstrated this, is not only to focus on the headline-grabbing disputes. And as Secretary General, yes, has to focus on the headline-grabbing disputes, but there are also other conflicts. And a good example was the very effective mediation that he did between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula. And the dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula did not make international headlines, but it had been a source of conflict between these two countries for decades. Cameroon had taken Nigeria to the International Court of Justice. But Kofi recognized, even before the International Court of Justice rendered its decision, that whatever the outcome, whatever the decision of the International Court of Justice was, this would be a very difficult decision for Nigeria and Cameroon to accept, and that a decision by the International Court of Justice would not be sufficient to solve this issue. So when the court rendered its decision, finding that sovereignty over the Bakassi Peninsula lay with Nigeria, this became, of course, a very difficult issue within Nigeria. But Kofi's patient diplomacy over a number of years eventually led to an agreement, the Green Tree Agreement, which led to the implementation of the International Court's decision and the prevention of what could have been a major interstate conflict between, the most populous country in Africa, a hegemon in West Africa, and Cameroon. And it demonstrates also that at times, yes, you need a judgment, a judicial decision, but that has to be complemented by effective mediation by a Secretary General to have a successful outcome.
Well, where was he in the Taiwan Strait? Except, of course, that Taiwan is not a UN member, so it's a difficult one-sided battle that he's engaged in. In fact, I did actually cross swords with him about the admission of Taiwanese journalists to the United Nations at the time, and it was clear he was very uncomfortable because he wasn't opposed to the principle, but when the Chinese say no, then if you're the Secretary General of the UN, you have to listen to them at least. It was one of the few occasions, I think, where his principles slipped a little in the face of bullying pragmatism from the PRC.
Yes, well, China, of course, is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And as you say, Taiwan is not a member of the UN. And a Secretary General takes his decisions from the deliberative organs of the UN, usually the Security Council and the General Assembly. And it is within the framework of those decisions that the Secretary General can set an agenda of his own. And there are constraints, notably the constraint you've just mentioned, where you have the interests of a permanent member of the Security Council, which can constrain what a Secretary General can and cannot do. And that's one of the realities of the position of Secretary General, because you're not a head of state and you're not a head of government.
In fact, officially, in protocol terms, he's only a foreign secretary, a foreign minister, if I remember rightly. Well, how many guns he gets on a salute and how many motorcycle outriders he gets. I know that you treat him as a head of state, but that's a courtesy. On the strict protocol terms, he's just a foreign minister.
Well, in fact, the Charter of the UN refers to the Secretary General as the Chief Administrative Officer of the organization. But of course, over the years, he's not only the Chief Administrative Officer of the organization, he also has a diplomatic role. He has a role as a norm entrepreneur, an initiator of ideas, an initiator of policies. And in fact, the Chief Administrative Officer role, which is often overlooked, which is the way the Secretary General is described in the Charter, Kofi took that role very seriously, because he had spent his entire career
Being administrated.
in the UN. And so he wanted to improve the organization and to make it a more effective and a more efficient instrument of the collective will of the member states. And he made a number of innovations as in his role as chief administrative officer. So, for example, it is commonplace in governments that you have a cabinet to run things. But the United Nations had never had a cabinet until Kofi set up the senior management group to give him advice and to bring the senior officials of the UN round the table, which was an important innovation. He also recognized, he had the inner confidence to recognize that as Secretary General, he had over 30, I think, senior officials reporting directly to him. And he thought, well, a Secretary General needs help. So he was the one who recommended to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly accepted that you would have a position of the Deputy Secretary General, which is again another legacy of him to the organization, that you needed a Deputy Secretary General who could share the burden and who could help to run the organization administratively. And it took a tremendous degree, I think, of self-confidence in order to do that, and a recognition of what the organization needed. And of course, I am immensely grateful that it was also Kofi Annan who set up the strategic planning unit, of which I was the director. And he recognized that, it's a sort of the norm in foreign ministries to have a policy planning unit or a strategic planning unit, but the UN hadn't had one. And Kofi felt that it was key to have a strategic planning unit to help to do the long-term planning and thinking about his annual priorities and to support the work that he was trying to do. So he really understood the UN. He was better prepared than I think any of his predecessors had been. And he understood the dysfunctionalities of the organization.
But he was also better supported because he had you mentioned the cabinet. A lot of those people would have been appointed by outside governments as heads of the various agencies, because it is one of the peculiarities of the UN that the senior officials get appointed by outsiders who spend their lives trying to thwart the activities. Well, not always. It's amazing how often they get adopted and sucked into the system. So, even American Republicans become convinced developers and social democrats were an appointed visit. This is the old days, not current Republicans, I suspect. Although he did coax, how was it, 200 million out of George W. Bush for the AIDS initiative, which was a fairly stunning achievement in the face of hostility to the organization from all around him. It's one of the things, one of the few things we remember fondly about George W. Apart from him being misunderestimated. But the other thing about Kofi was that he had amplification. He had a core of senior officials who were known and respected in their own right, whose opinions were sought after. And they could say controversial things, which he could then disavow if they went too far, or adopt if they were successful. It was a very cunning bait and switch routine he pulled. People like Mark Malloch Brown, John Ruggie, the others were where they could come up with ideas and initiatives and then see how the world sucked them and liked them or not, and then run with them. And this gave him huge amplification rather than one lone voice sort of preaching in the pulpit in the chapel at the back of the church.
Yes, I think that again absolutely is a reflection of his leadership style. He had a leadership style which was very inclusive. He also would give clear strategic directions to his senior officials, but he gave them the room and the space for them, for example, to meet with the Security Council. Before Kofi took office, the senior leaders in the years preceding him becoming Secretary General did not brief the Security Council. So he allowed his senior officials to brief the Security Council, to have a role. And he had confidence in his officials around him. So it was a leadership style which was very inclusive. He empowered those around him. And as you say, he also brought in fresh ideas into the somewhat claustrophobic, sometimes claustrophobic world of diplomacy. So he was very interested in bringing academics from outside, having views from outside the organization. And then his skill was to take those ideas and to turn them into policy which would be acceptable to the member states. Another, of course, of his initiatives was his lecture series. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, he felt that there should be an opportunity to bring fresh ideas to the organization, to help bring the UN, the member states, the diplomats with the permanent missions, the staff together. And so he launched this lecture series, which he would host. And he had distinguished thinkers, Nobel laureates like Toni Morrison, who gave the initial lecture on the humanities after 9/11. He had Amartya Sen and Kwame Appiah to talk about identity in the 21st century. He brought Archbishop Desmond Tutu to talk about God's word and world politics. And all of these ideas created intellectual ferment within the organization. And so he was open to new ideas. He was also open to partnerships. And he recognized the importance of partnerships in trying to get things done and in trying to fulfill the UN's mission. So for him, you had to go beyond interstate cooperation if you were going to succeed. And the partnerships involved civil society, non-governmental organizations, and in the most dramatic change from his predecessors, he reached out to the business community and established the Global Compact. This, of course, was considered heresy in some parts of the UN, that the Secretary General would reach out to the business community. But he saw that the business community had resources, it had expertise, which could be leveraged to the advantage of the UN, particularly in trying to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And for civil society NGOs, this was all part of helping to create improve the legitimacy of the UN, to open the UN, to make it more transparent in terms of its intergovernmental work. So he was a very innovative thinker and leader in that way. So he had a realistic humility about the UN's purposes, and he combined that, I think, with bold and visionary leadership, and thereby maximizing the organization's potential where it had an important role to play.
Well, there's a sort of bit of a caveat there, of course, is that it's a tightrope walk. I mean, Elon Musk doesn't bring transparency. He'll blow holes in the organization if you give too much say. So how can you take his money that he's looted from everybody else and use it for official UN purposes rather than using it to subvert UN purposes on behalf of Tesla and Musk? It's a delicate tightrope which we've seen in several Western governments that pursued this, that it tends to subvert collective decisions on behalf of the wills of the check writers.
It is a tightrope walk, as you say. the Secretary General's role is a tightrope walk. It's a tightrope between the P5 and the rest of the membership. You are walking a tightrope between the member states who are jealous of their prerogatives when you want to open up to civil society. And of course, it's a tightrope walk when you're embracing reaching out to the business sector, which is why I said it was a very controversial move at the time, because there were I always say you have the traditionalists always within the UN, and then of course you have the reformers who felt that the traditionalists felt that you should not reach out to the business sector because of the risks, the very real risks. There were member states who felt that this would be a threat to their autonomy in terms of economic decision making. But Kofi recognized that all the huge problems that we're dealing with, from climate change, from migration, to migration, climate change, all the global issues, you do need not only member states, you need the help, the support of the private sector. You need partnerships with civil society if you're going to achieve these goals. Not easy, difficult, but he felt that you would not be able to succeed otherwise.
Well, you might like them, but they are there. He recognized that you have to deal with them. Just as he didn't court the gallery, but he knew how to make a good public impression. A friend of mine, a famous British comedian, always asking me where he got his suits made. He was very impressed with them, because he always looked very dapper when he came on there, even when it was to have John Bolton throw bricks at him. So it was, but he managed to keep his cool and managed, one of the questions is, why did he keep doing Morgan Freeman imitations? They're very successful.
Well, he, in fact, on Morgan Freeman, he when he left office, he was fond of giving this anecdote that when he left office, he had gone with his wife Nan and thought they would have a very quiet time and try to recover from all the exertions of the 10 years as Secretary General. And they'd gone to a small town, and somebody ran up to him and asked for the autograph because they felt he was Morgan Freeman. So he dutifully signed Morgan Freeman. There was this very striking resemblance, for sure. He was
also the demeanor. I mean, there's no accident that Morgan Freeman is cast as the sage, the wise, the beneficent God. Even I don't think Kofi had any.
No, he was. There were certain personal qualities which he had, I think, which also were important for his leadership. He had a certain decency about him. He had a remarkable calmness, even in the face of tremendous pressures. He could always be calm. And he was exactly the way he was in dealing with his staff as he was in his public persona. He never raised his voice. He had a real control about his emotions. He had empathy. I think he had deep empathy. He could put himself in the shoes of other people. A genuine concern for other people, an interest in the lives of other people, and motivated also to make the world better for other people. He was also, I think, as a Secretary General, he was able to be a bridge builder, and he was a conciliator by instinct. And so he could bring people from different backgrounds, different political views together and was a great conciliator. So all of those personal qualities, I think, also helped in terms of being a leader. And they were grounded also in certain principles which he had. The importance of multilateralism, which was inclusive and effective, the importance of international cooperation, and that if you were going to deal with what he called problems without passports, you needed, if you were dealing with problems without passports, you also needed blueprints without borders, and that none of these problems would be solved without international cooperation.
At the risk of like perpetual cynicism, it's all right being a bridge builder as long as you don't build bridges in Baltimore. Emily Pons wants to know, well, she has two questions rolled together. Is the United Nations continuing to welcome fresh and new ideas today? Well, there's old ideas getting rammed on it, but you'll let you answer. And what does the future of the United Nations look like? And to put that in context, at the moment, we have an intractable problem in the Middle East with an unvetoable, well, it seems an unvetoable initiative on the part of Israel, backed by the US, opposed by the rest of the world. You have Rwanda brewing up again. You have Myanmar curdling away, and you have the Serbs kicking over the traces in possibility, and Ukraine and Russia. So where does the United Nations go from here? At the moment, it looks like it's a firefighter with a bucket of water in the middle of a raging conflagration.
Well, no, the organization is clearly going through very difficult times with huge challenges. And you've mentioned a number of the key challenges facing the organization. We have a Security Council, which is essentially paralyzed and deadlocked. And when the Security Council is paralyzed and deadlocked, you have the institution which has primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. So it is very hard for it to maintain its work in peace and security when it is deadlocked. The organization is, and even the makeup of the Security Council, the legitimacy of the Security Council is being questioned because it reflects the political and economic realities of a bygone world in 1945, and there's been an inability to reform the council. So that's it's a huge problem for the organization. We also have countries questioning and requesting that peacekeeping operations should leave. So their territory, which is creating challenges for peacekeeping. We also have, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals and the need, of course, to ramp up support and for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the organization is going through difficult times, but I think Kofi Annan, who was an inveterate optimist to the very end, and he always tried to see the glass as half full, would look at areas and say that you have to it is all we've got. And so the organization efforts have to be made to improve its effectiveness. We also have to look at the caliber of the leaders that we have in the organization at all levels, if it is to really make a difference on peace and security and human rights and economic and social issues. And of course, ultimately, we get an organization which the member states want. So we have to keep pushing the member states to strengthen the organization, and that civil society and business, the private sector, they also have a role to play to make sure that we have an organization which is fit for purpose.
Well, I think that's all we have time for now, Abby. Thanks very much for a timely discussion about Kofi, of whom I think fondly. Often, he's one of the few people I've reported who called me up when he thought I got something right, and yet didn't call up to give me the finger when he thought I got it wrong. This is the Foreign Press Association in New York. Our next speaker is going to be Ali Velshi from MSNBC, and he is drawing together his family background, his colonial imperialist victim background, he's not calling it that, and the current state of journalism. His memoir is very readable, very cogent, and addresses a lot of the issues that we have now about telling the truth in the face of overwhelming power. So that'll be announced shortly as soon as we've got it, whether it'll be in person or on Zoom. I've got to negotiate with him. But Ali Velshi has been one of the people who has always stood out independently without truckling to power. And of course, he's one of the martyrs of the age of reporters because he was hit by a rubber bullet in Minnesota during the Black Lives Matter riots. Clearly marked as press, and the rubber bullet got him because he was clearly marked. So it shows the times we're living in. It wasn't just Kofi Annan's UN had a hard time. The press, the Fourth Estate is also under siege. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Abby, and let us keep in touch and see how your book goes and what we'll do. Who knows? We'll have more times to discuss Kofi Annan's legacy, because he also pioneered on immigration, on climate control, several other very prescient issues which weren't on the agenda at the time. People rolled their eyes and said, what's he on about? And then now the floods are rolling up on the beaches and they realize, oh, he was right. So thanks very much, Abby. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Okay, everybody. See you soon, I hope. Goodbye. And if you're interested in the Foreign Press Association, we're always short of members, initiative, and money. Any of these you can send to us. We'd be very grateful to get. Thanks a lot. Bye.